Again, thank you for coming out this morning. I'm Janelle Nolan. I'm in charge of the marketing and adult programming here at the library. I forgot. So again, thank you for braving the cold temperatures. It's my pleasure to introduce Scott Canfield, a retired entrepreneur and now a full-time historian. And he's so excited to share his research that was assisted by the Bradford Historical Society, and even the Bradford Library kicked in a little bit of information. So welcome to the Veil of Fire program.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How are you doing, all things considered? And there's a lot of things to consider today. Like Janelle was saying, if I forget things and have to look at my notes a lot, please excuse me. But I wanted to welcome you to Veil of Fire, which is the name of a short story I did about a year ago, and I'm now developing it into a book. The further we researched it, we were able to come up with a complete story of all the details I didn't know originally. And they're quite interesting. They're more than I can get into today, but we'll tell you as much as we possibly can. And I want to thank Janelle for having me. And I want to thank you all for coming out on a morning like this. My truck battery wouldn't start, so I had to get a ride over here. But I am a storyteller and a writer. I've been writing and storytelling for about 40 years. And I know your community very well. I've been down here on business for about 45 years. And in 1998 or 99, I started the Jeep Jamboree. So if you don't care for all the Jeeps underfoot, don't hold that against me. I'm retired from that also. My buddy took over running that. But I'm just getting a little bit too old to climb in and out of high Jeeps. So, yeah, and I'm very happy to be here today in Bradford to tell Bradford people a Bradford story. And I want to conduct a little survey. Any of you that were born and raised here are lifers in Bradford. Could I see a show of hands? Okay, keep them up. Now, anybody that has not heard this train story, leave your hand up. Ooh, it looks like, well, we have one newbie anyway. But I suspect you haven't heard a lot of the details. Okay, a couple others. Well, some of the younger people may not have heard it. I'm not really surprised because this happened 138 years ago last weekend in January. It was a Tuesday, the 15th, 1884. It was a day like today, only with more snow. They estimated about 3 foot of snow then. Bitter cold, and people were going to be riding this excursion train over, or commuter train if you want to call it, to Bradford. They were on their way. So I want to give you a little bit of a timeline here so you understand where we're at. Now in 1884, the eastern part of this country was pretty civilized. Things were going well with trains and everything. Not the case out west, Montana, Utah. You still had Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids were holding up trains out there at the same time this accident happened. If that gives you any kind of an idea of the time slot. They had the BBK, Bradford, Bordell, and Kinzu, really never had any robberies, train robberies, or anything like that, which is kind of surprising. But I guess it was just the nature of the way the country developed. So, okay, let's see. But at the time it happened, this was really big news. Dispatches went out to about 20,000 of the largest cities in the United States and their big city newspapers. They sent journalists, reporters, and photographers to cover this story. This was really big news in the big cities. And it's surprising, photography was in its infancy, but still there were, it was coming along pretty good. And we're surprised that we don't have more pictures of this. The only picture we have is the first picture in the book, which is the only known photograph of the train accident after it derailed. Why there weren't more, I don't know. Maybe they were lost. There were, and they were lost to time. It's kind of hard to say. I'm talking 138 years ago. Now, before I start the story, I want to give some credit to our team. We were really interested in this. We got together. There are two parts to our team: the researchers and us field people. And we call ourselves Team BBK for the Bradford, Bordell, and Kinzu. And the train is the number 11. This is the focus of the story. Plus the 3 women that died on it, the only 3 that died on the actual train. There was another man that died later from his injuries. But, so, the first part of our team were the researchers and helpers. My wife, a big help to me. Molly Lindahl and Sally Kostick from the Landmark Society did a lot of research for us. Kelly or Kathy Elmore from here did some research, and then a gal by the name of Emily Cluck from the Oil City Library did an awful lot more too, because one of the women was from Oil City that died. So we got pictures of her monument. She came from a very well-to-do family, and we haven't been down to see it yet. We want to go see that gravestone too, and we'll have pictures of that. But for now, we're kind of focusing a lot more on Sadie. So then, now Molly told me that she'd been looking for Sadie's grave since about 2006. And we knew it was in Oak Hill Cemetery, but not quite sure where. So she'd been looking, and then one day she called me and she found it. And if you look at the one picture of a big honeysuckle, pile of honeysuckle, you can see why we never found it. She hadn't found it before. The whole grave was completely covered over. You couldn't even see it. So she went to work with her husband Kevin with chainsaws and all kinds of other evil-looking tools, and got it completely uncovered. And lo and behold, Sadie was not believed to have had a headstone. She had a headstone. And the top of it was laying down over the bank. Molly and Kevin did a great job exposing the gravesite. So we got our team together. We're the Jeep team. And we do all the field work. We went out to see the tracks and the location of the accident, verify it, take pictures, make maps. One of the guys on our team, Mike and Jarek, made maps for us. Our Jeep team, field team, consisted of myself, my grandson that I flew out here from Seattle, who was a real train buff, and several members of the Puller family, and Tim Wright. And let me see, I think that's about everybody that all went out in the woods. So we found out about Sadie's grave and went out there in the morning. Chainsaws, every other tool you could pack on a Jeep. And lo and behold, we get there, and here's a huge dead pine across the road up to Sadie's grave that had just fallen the night before, because Molly had been out there and saw that it was still standing. So if I guess I was a superstitious person, I would say maybe this is an omen. Maybe Sadie doesn't want her grave uncovered. Maybe she wants the peace and quiet. I don't know, but I'm not that superstitious. We were on a mission. So the guys got out of the Jeeps with the chainsaws and cut that tree to pieces, and away we went. I do have to say it's the first time that I ever had to use a chainsaw on a Jeep to get into a cemetery. I didn't expect that, but... So we got there, and we saw the situation, and I got my truck in position. I have a picture of it, and I have a winch in the back of my truck. So we winched the top of her tombstone up, stood it up beside the base of her grave, put posts in the ground to steady it, and then banded it all together. And since that time, Molly's been babysitting it, something beautiful. Her and Kevin have cleaned the stone, painted the posts we put in the ground, shortened them because they were too high, and the banding we put around, colored that. We're thinking about putting planting flowers in the spring. So we're really happy to locate Sadie. Her maiden name was Stoop. She was buried with some of her siblings. So most of the graves were covered over. And then after we got that cleared up, the Jeep team went out to the woods, and we found what's logging trails now, but it's where the train ran. And it was kind of a muddy mess, rainy afternoon, but we pretty much found where we believe the train rounded the curve, and where up about 150 feet there was a plateau where the oil tank sat. It's hard to tell. Mother Nature reclaims everything pretty well, but it looked to be pretty much right with our GPS readings and all the other information we had. So we took pictures, and a quick video clip will show you. See, pictures will show you what it looks like now. You wouldn't know it from a logging trail. It's basically the way it was. We wanted to come down out to where the station used to be, but they had dug a real big water bar, because I think ATVs and four-wheelers were running through it too much. So we weren't able to take the Jeeps over. It was a real big water bar. So we took plenty of pictures. Now, are you ready to go on a train ride? Sure. A train ride you won't soon forget. Well, I'm going to put you right aboard the train so you can hear what some of the conversations were. And we know these to be factual, most of them anyway. Sometimes I had to bridge the gap a little bit. And you'll see what it was like between the passengers and the staff and everything like that. Okay, so just to tell you a little something about the BBK number 11 train. It was called narrow gauge. For those of you that don't understand what that is, it means that the tracks are no more than 3 foot wide, width of this yardstick. And the train overhung the tracks a little bit, but it was not a big train in the sense that you would picture a big locomotive, like some of the ones out west or today or across the country. It was small. There were only 3 cars on it: the engine, the baggage car, where the men hung out and smoked cigars and sipped brandy and discussed politics, and the passenger coach at the back, where the families were, the men and women and children, most of the families. So there were only 3 of them, not even a caboose on it. Okay, it's 6:30 in the morning, Wellsville, New York. A cold winter morning just like this, only with more snow. It was estimated there was probably around 3 foot of snow, and it was up to the windows of the cars. So roughly 20-25 people boarded there in Wellsville, all bound for Bradford, which would get in, the train would get in before noon, for whatever purpose they were coming for. If it was for business, visit family, shopping, whatever, this was your way of getting around, short of a horse or walking or a buggy or carriage, and pretty rough country for that. So everybody climbed on board at 6:30 in the morning. I can't imagine being up that early to get on a train, especially a morning like this. So the train left Wellsville and stopped at a lot of the little towns along the way, picking up more passengers. And then it got down to Kinzu Junction, where Sadie got on, Sadie Fair, her married name now, and 2 other women, Katie Moran, who was about 27 and single, so we're not sure she was originally from Oil City. We kind of figured she might have been up here living in Aiken and working in Bradford. It was the best thing we could figure, or she was visiting somebody up here. Sadie and her husband, Lou, were on, and I believe he was working for an oil company, and we're not sure where she was headed to Bradford. What a lot of people didn't know, and the newspapers missed, was that she was 22 and just married 2 years, and she had a baby. The baby was not with her on the train, with her and her husband. Nobody knows to this day where he was, with family either in Kinzu Junction where she lived, or in Bradford, family or friends, and maybe she was going to get the child. But he grew up motherless, grew up with his father to be about 95 before he died, and then everybody knew more about him, but not why he wasn't on the train with her that day. Just a hand of fate, I guess, I don't know. So in Kinzu Junction, the train got its last bit of water, big water reserve tank nearby, and started on its way. This was probably around 9 o'clock. So I'm giving it to you from the perspective of the people on the train. In the engine was, of course, the engineer, Pat Sexton, and right beside him was his fireman, Mike Walsh. So they're going out, it's a crystal clear day. As cold as it is, it's still a beautiful day, and they're going through the snow, and it was such a pretty picture. It looked like something out of Courier Knives, like a dinner plate or something. Just seeing this train with all the snow up window light was beautiful. But no one on board the train knew that within the next 10 minutes, it was going to look like something out of the story of Dante's Inferno or otherwise hell within about 15 minutes as they're rounding the curve. So Pat Sexton looks over at Mike and says, "Hey, everything's going great. Train's working good, no problems, nice clear day. We'll be in Bradford, half hour, 45 minutes, something like that. I'm really happy." And Mike just giving a thumbs up, "Yeah, that sounds real good." So back in the baggage car, like I was saying, were the men that were smoking cigars. There wasn't a lot to do on a train other than read a newspaper, take a nap, or look out the window. So a lot of them just went up there to discuss politics, and it was probably a pretty lively place there. And of course the baggage car, where Lou and Sadie sat. So it was cold in those trains. They only had a small wood stove. Everybody huddled around that or dressed very warm to get them there safely without freezing to death. Sadie was, from what we could tell, bundled up in a long coat and snuggled up, trying to keep warm. And well, she turned to her husband Lou and said, "Well, Lou, how much longer we have to go to get to Bradford? This snow's getting really boring." And he said, "Well, we're close now, probably a half hour, 45 minutes. And so they're sitting there when a woman walks into the car, and there's no seat for her. So Lou, being the perfect gentleman, got up, said, "Here, take my seat." We can only imagine it was probably Katie Moran, she lived in that same vicinity. And from what we could tell, Sadie, Katie, and Hannah, the other one, probably knew each other if they rode this train with any length of time at all, because they lived close together. So that was very gentlemanly of him to get up and leave his wife in the passenger coach. So, anyway, back into the engine. Pat Sexton and Mike Walsh are watching things as they go, and something catches Pat Sexton's eyes on up ahead. And he looks and grabs his binoculars, and he goes, "Oh my God, Mike, there's oil on the tracks. It's covering all the tracks. I can't stop this train in time." And Mike said, "Well, maybe we can just blow through it." He barely got the words out of his mouth, and the train was right in the oil. The sparks from the engine ignited the oil instantly, and crude oil is extremely flammable, burns very hot, lets off a lot of chemicals. And it had been covering the tracks for some time. It had been a tank about 150 feet on a hill upside, this close to the train, and it had run down. The tank had breached and had been running down for some time. It had been seen that it was running down, leaking in times past too, in summer. People knew about this. Well, once the oil was lit, it ran down the tracks like a serpent that you see out front of the train. They looked out the side window, and then it followed the oil back up the hill to the tank and blew the tank sky high. So by this point, the passengers are really starting to panic. They see what's starting to happen. The oil, flaming oil, was being thrown up on the train from its wheels, faster than they could do anything. And Pat Sexton says to Mike, "There's nothing much I can do about this now. At this point, if I stop the train, the flames are going to come up directly and burn everybody." So the only thing he had left to do, and by this time the controls were all red hot, the cab was actually on fire, was reach for the reverse. And he pulled it with all his might. They were red. It left the impression on his hand, burnt the flesh off his hand so it was peeling off it like a glove. And then he threw the throttle full. So this was in hopes of slowing the train down enough for the people to jump off it. It was all he had left to do. So then he told Mike, "We have to jump. There's nothing more we can do. We've got to get out of here." So they jumped off, landed in the snow, and away the train went on its merry way, unconducted. And by this time, the passengers are saying, "We got to get off this." Now, the conductor inside had tried to keep the people on the train for a little bit longer because he thought it would be safer. He didn't know, so he closed off many of the doors. And it probably did help save lives, but it was not the solution. Everyone knew they had to get off that train as fast as possible. And the only way he had was going through the windows, which were really narrow. To try to jump out the side doors, you'd be jumping into a wall of fire. It was like suicide. So everybody started flocking to the windows, trying to get out of these little apertures that wouldn't hardly open. Most people got off one at a time. Little kids jumped off on their own. Adults threw babies and children out. They all jumped off, and about 30 people got off that train. Thankful for the snow, it served people from not to get broken bones or anything like that, plus salve their burns. Almost everybody on the train got burned in one way or another. The whole cab passenger coach was empty in just a matter of minutes. That's how fast everybody was desperate to get off that train, except for the 3 women. Sadie was seen running and falling as if fainting. George McCartney, a newsboy on the train, went to try to save her. He met a wall of fire. He couldn't get near her. And then her husband was beside himself because he'd left her in the car. He ran, and about 5 guys tackled him and wouldn't let him go back there. He couldn't fight him off. He couldn't get in there. And just knowing what was going on, he just dropped to his knees sobbing. He knew he wouldn't see his wife again. So Sadie was down. And that kind of gives us a clue as to what may have happened to the other 2. All the toxic fumes, some of the research I did, the toxic fumes coming off of crude oil would probably put you out pretty quick. So as to whether they suffered or not, we don't know, but we're kind of doubtful. We really think they went out. Katie tried to get out one of the windows, got halfway out and got stuck. A girdle. The clothing the women wore back then were bulky enough that she was stuck. She couldn't get back in, she couldn't get out. Hannah, we don't know what happened with her. We can only imagine she probably passed out too. So, as time went on, the train had rubber brake hoses, and they were burnt. It did not have the best braking system in the world on it, because in 1864 there was a braking system called the George Westinghouse brake system. steel lines that wouldn't burn. Train did not have that. So once the brake lines burned, off went the train. It was on a downhill slope and it was rolling pretty good. Not quite as steep as some of the reporters mentioned. We found out for ourselves when we were out there that it wasn't quite that steep a grade, but it doesn't take much for that kind of weight to get rolling. And it went about half a mile and hit what was called a recurve, where a curve goes one way and then quickly back the other. The train was going too fast to negotiate it and it derailed. The engine was rolled upside down, baggage car was still upright, but in pretty bad shape, and then the passenger coach had been burnt right down to the windows. So had anybody been on board, they wouldn't have made it. But there were only, I think, 2 of the women's bodies were found on the train. So, in Bradford, Colonel John Carter, the president of the BBK Railroad, was notified. He was sitting at his desk. He immediately gathered up a rescue train, stocked it with medical supplies, blankets, and rounded up any of the doctors here in Bradford that he possibly could. And they sent the train out there. They got there, and on their way out, they're seeing people laying in the snow all the way along, and they didn't know if they could help or any of them. A lot of them had their faces burned, their arms, their fingers. Just almost everybody got burnt out of roughly 30 people there. And then 2 of the women's bodies, I think, were still on the train. Now, Katie's was catapulted from the window when the train rolled over, and gruesomely enough, she wound up sitting upright in the snow. And the rest of the passengers could do anything, saw how horrible it was, and they covered them over with snow. So the rescue train and the doctors picked everyone up, brought them back to Bradford here, where they spent weeks recuperating. They were either in hotels or private homes. The 3 women, they put them on a platform on the train and covered them over with a blanket to take them to the morgue. They didn't want anyone to see how horrible it was. And in my short story, I spared the graphics. I didn't know if I wanted to say it here or put it in a real book, but some of the women on our team, and I'm not going to name names, said, "Tell them the graphics." Okay, I really want to hear it. They're grown-ups, they can handle it. The women's bodies were charred to a crisp. There was nothing left of their hair or clothing. Their arms had burnt off. Their bodies were totally unrecognizable. It was just really sad. And that's kind of what got me interested in the story. Once I read that, I wanted to know how, why, where, and when, and who was responsible for this. There has to be more details. So that's what I'm working on now. Molly has found an awful lot of information. And this goes up the line to a lot of bigger names and bigger money and bigger people. There were cover-ups, conspiracies. This was a terrible embarrassment for the oil company and the railroad. So they got everybody back, and then there were the hearings. There were 2 hearings. The coroner's inquest, which just established the facts, and then the courthouse hearing. And this dragged on for a few weeks. There was so much confusing testimony and infighting back and forth and finger pointing between the BBK and Anchor Oil Company, who was to blame. The jury was taken out to the wreck site, and they weren't able to determine a whole lot either. So as this continued on and fighting got worse, John Carter, the president of BBK, stood up and said, I forgot one thing too. The jury and the people all thought it was humorous that the only ones testifying were the lawyers for the 2 companies. And they thought it humorous to see them put on the stand for a change. But after it was getting nowhere, John Carter stood up and said, it was an act of God. And this really angered the people of Bradford. It pretty much stopped the hearing right then and there. And the hearing ended up inconclusive without facts. But the Bradford people were really infuriated about this. So that was the end of the major hearings. And for years to come, there were a lot of private lawsuits and hearings, and not a one of them justified the women. There was too much legal power blocking the big companies, and they stopped it. So that was basically the story. Now there is a lot more to it, like I said. It gets deep, it gets complicated, more than I have time to get into today, but it does point a finger at who was guilty. I will say this much, the BBK Railroad and Anchor Oil both had a part in it. They were both responsible once all the facts were brought out in the open. And these poor women, they weren't even recognizable. Katie's brother came up from Oil City and recognized her by jewelry she had on. Hannah's husband didn't even know she was on the train. He was off on business. And they were trying to find her to see if she could have been one of them. Well, he found her and recognized her. And then, of course, Sadie's husband, Lou, and then his wife was there. So things just pretty much quieted out after that. Anytime anyone tried a lawsuit, they didn't have much success. But in my book, I mentioned one of the people that did have a lawsuit. It wasn't that successful, but brought out an awful lot of information about people behind the scenes that were responsible for this. But that is the basic story of the BBK number 10. And I hope to have a more complete story by this spring or this summer. I'm working on it. Every time I start, I got to rewrite it because I've left something out. I want to get most of the details in. But I want to thank you all for coming out this morning and being such good listeners. This is us trying to get into the cemetery.
Before we even get up to the grave, the pine tree fell down across the road. So we got Blaine and his brother Roy clearing it. But the guys here did a good job.
I have to redo the plaque. I made a plaque for him. And at the time, we thought Linda was the name of the third woman, but it's Hannah. So I got to redo the plaque. Boy, the cemetery is all hills. You gotta slide down and look carefully to get where you're
See
going.
if you can see how we can look back at the pictures. Had that down for years and never learned how to look at the pictures after you take them.
I'm not a tech whiz.
No. You know what?
Yeah, this is where the railroad tracks are, what it looked like today. This is your big bank up here, and above it, only 150 feet, was the oil tank. Now that tank contained 10,500 gallons of crude oil, and most of it had leaked
There's a
out.
gradual curve here.
That's a lot of oil.
We think this might have been the last curve that the BBK came around and derailed. Probably like down over this embankment right here.
Back in 1884, this would have been pretty much a bare hillside. No trees.
Blaine and the boys are down looking over the embankment. But it's Blaine's guess that as you look this path, I think this is a curve in the track where Blaine feels might have been the last curve. From where I'm standing, right about where I'm standing, look at this. The point I'm standing is about maybe where the train went derailed, down over the bank right here. About a half a mile back. Now looking on ahead, another 3 miles would take you into Bradford, the way the jeeps are faced. So this is where the railroad grade would have continued on into Bradford.
Ironically, the track runs behind the Oak Hill Cemetery.
They're down over the embankment here where they
Ladies,
make
fine,
the round
brother.
of it. Blaine, the lead. The other guys coming along behind them.
Incidentally, the whole accident occurred from the time the train caught fire till it derailed was probably less than 15 minutes. That's how quick it was, and about 30 people got out the windows in that short time.
Hi.
Alan,
Take a look at this. See if you can see how we can look back at the pictures.
Okay, this is
Trying to figure out how to engineer the tombstone. Boy, that was one heavy piece of masonry.
You know what, I think this sharp curve.
You don't want to show that one, our experiment. Okay. That's basically it. You're basically looking at a short shot of what we saw that day. There's a gradual curve here. We think this might have been the last curve that the BBK came around.
I have a question.
Yes,
Did you ever consider, or think about getting a metal detector up there?
It was mentioned, we didn't have one with us handy at the time,
Yeah.
but we might go back sometime this summer, and that would be a good thing to see.
Surely there's something left.
Yeah, well, we did find, I was given as a gift a section of rail. And it's not, you notice there's a bend on it, and it's not because it's bent, it's because it's curved to negotiate a curve. But we're relatively sure that the BBK number 11 had passed over on that rail at one point or another. Yeah, there probably are tons of railroad spikes, I would have to guess. When they pulled the tracks up, they just threw those.
Or even part of the train, that's what I'm thinking.
Oh, that would be nice. But they did say the tracks were cleaned up in record time, and it still amazes us that they could get all the debris. If you look at the picture of the train accident, how they got that well, the tracks were cleared. Doesn't necessarily mean all the train was picked up, but in pretty good time, they must have had equipment with cranes on it that cleared everything off the tracks pretty fast.
You have to wonder how they got that locomotive back up on the rails.
That would have been interesting to see. I really wish there were more pictures available. And like I said, I'm surprised there weren't more taken.
Would the locomotive have been so damaged that it couldn't run again?
I would say. It was laying upside down. And if you look at the picture, you can see it looks like a big pile of junk. Maybe it was stripped for parts or something, I don't know.
But the track was rebuilt.
Oh yeah, the track was never damaged. So it stayed in use. And they were very fortunate they didn't have another thing like that. Of course, they corrected the problem with the oil tank leak.
Yeah.
Well, because the oil tank itself was blown up. And since it was blown up, they didn't have any real evidence as to why it leaked. It was another reason that they couldn't go any further with investigation. But the sights that the people must have seen watching the fire shoot out ahead of the train, and then look over and then see it go back up the bank and blow this tank up with all this crude oil. By that time, you were going to get through one of the narrow windows no matter what you had to do. And some of the people were large, they couldn't get through the windows. But it's amazing that out of about 30 people who were on that train, about 27, something like that, all survived, even with severe burns. And the women probably would have gotten off had the circumstances not been what they were for them. They probably would have gotten off, and it would have been a miracle that there wasn't one death. But there were only maybe 2 or 3 people that weren't burnt or injured in any way. Mostly everybody got burnt at one point or another. The flames were coming up to the window height. And the fact that the flames were coming so high, this is why I titled it Veil of Fire. It was like looking out a window through a veil. Now, the air draft across the top of the trains, the passenger car being in the back, the coach, suffered the worst because it was the last one. And it got what was called backdraft. Like if you've ever seen an Indy race or Daytona 500, if you look at a string of the cars, the last one is wobbling a little bit because it's catching the backdraft. The air can't go on any further to another surface, so it drops right afterwards. And that's what happened with the passenger coach. It got the majority of the flames. So.
Another question, how did they, in Bradford, that they know that this had happened? I mean, could you see the fire from the city? It's 3 miles, you said, so.
Well, I don't think so. Now, Patrick Sexton, the engineer, even though his hands were burnt to where he couldn't use them, hiked, it was, by that time, was almost what was called tar port, which doesn't exist anymore now. Bradford's absorbed it. The hotel we were staying in was on Tarport Extension Road, which I was surprised, but all it is East Kendall Avenue area now. And he hiked in, Pat Sexton, through the deep snow and got in and told people in Bradford.
Okay.
And imagine that happening so quick, and then him hiking the extra mile through deep snow. Got the word out.
At what time exactly in the morning would this have been?
Probably about 9:30,
Okay.
quarter to 10. They would have been in Bradford in about another half hour. That
Was there a
close.
hospital at this time in Bradford?
Pardon?
Was there a real hospital in Bradford?
I don't know that. I'm not reversed on that old
there was,
history of
but,
Bradford.
I'm not sure.
I would
Like a
have thought there would have been
farmhouse
some kind
kind
of
of
medical
thing, yeah.
facility, but certainly, I don't know if there was a full-scale Sally or Molly.
No, just sort of like a farmhouse kind of
Okay,
hospital.
yeah, and you can imagine none of the equipment like you've got today, and all they could do was the basic stuff on these people. They had their ears burnt. Now Pat Sexton, the engineer, he had his eyelids burned off.
Ooh.
I can't even imagine how you'd sleep. He had surgery done over, I think, in Binghamton, and back then, they were able to put eyelids back on him. But he had his eyelids burned off, and his hands were useless. The heat was so searing, I'm not even sure what the temperature would have been. I'm still working on that, but it would have probably had to have been, I'm guessing right now, in the range of 700 to 800 degrees. And that burns about anything pretty fast. So I know some people in the fire department were making some guesses on that temperature, but it was fast. The flames were fanned so fast that it would only take minutes for people to fall, pass out if they didn't get fresh air. So it was pretty brutal, but it only happened. The newspapers were saying things like it took people in the countryside at the farms and homes were hearing the people on the train screaming as though it were a long ride. It was only half a mile. And like I say, we figured time-wise, we had it down to a science how fast the train could have been traveling, and it was probably only about 15 minutes from the time it caught fire to when it derailed. So it went by pretty quick. I don't think it traveled through the countryside where everybody could hear everybody on the train, but that's embellishment that goes with the media. That's what sells papers.
Yeah.
What was the max speed of that locomotive?
The train averaged 15 miles per hour, and which I find interesting. I never knew how fast those trains went. We'll see you folks. Thanks for coming. But if you're ever caught in a 25 mile per hour zone and have to slow down, and I know I have, it's very annoying, but you're still going 10 miles faster than that train was at 25 miles an hour. I've got my share of tickets at that. Going faster than 25 too. That moneymaker the police use. But yes.
You said he threw it in reverse?
Yes.
Was that just to slow it? But did it go forward?
It was still moving forward because of its weight and speed, but the reverse would have turned the wheels backwards and hopefully started to act as a little bit of a braking system. But at best, it would have maybe slowed it down some so that it wouldn't have gone full speed, or wouldn't have gained too much more than 15 miles an hour and give the people a chance to bail out the windows. When I write a story, I like to write it more from the human point of view. I don't know that much about trains, so I ask somebody to forgive me if I'm not exact on some details, but I like, instead of a dry history, I like to talk about what the people experienced, what they saw and felt, and what you would too if you were on that train, what it was like. I mean, to suddenly be thrown in a state of panic like that and no leadership, much like a sinking ship, like probably the people on the Titanic. No real leadership. You were on your own, and you better decide if it's better to stay on the train or get off it. You had to make your own decisions, and some would err on the side of caution and not get off. Others would say, hey, I'm going to take the chance, I got to get away from this. So it would split people many times in the way of thinking. It's amazing that as many decided to get off as possible. Mostly everybody must have had some good common sense on them and just said, I'm following the leader, I'm getting off this thing. But it was quite a tragedy, and it was a shame that really the blame wasn't publicly assessed to the people that were responsible. But they paid for it indirectly, like I said in a lot of details that I have in the book. Fate came around, but it's sad to this day that the women were really never justified having gone through that kind of thing. That's what really caught my attention.
How did you locate the grave?
That was Molly's doing. Molly is with the Landmark Society, and she'd been kind of looking for it. She had an approximation where it was. Maybe you can tell him better.
Well, there's lot layouts for that cemetery, so it gives you a general area where they are. And my husband and I went up there and into thinking, gee, it's just a shame. So it went, and so many times I've been through there, looked, I don't see anything, so decided to take a closer look.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, I see this little gray piece of stone there, which turned out to be much bigger. And so, kind of, with Scott's urging, I kind of decided I need to uncover that and see, because, you know, it seems such a shame there was no monument or anything to her, when in fact there was. So,
Good job.
just 12 and a half hours between my husband and I cleaning it up, we finally got it uncovered.
I told her we'd be down with jeeps and chainsaws and war clubs and everything. We'll find it and we'll clear it. By the time we get there, she's got it all cleared already. But at least we brought the winch to straighten her headstone up.
Yeah, that was amazing.
There was been no picking that up or sliding up or anything.
No, there wasn't.
That was one heavy piece of stone. It took a winch to pull that back up.
It did.
It took crazy jeepers and
Yes.
leftovers from the Jeep Jamboree. Some of us that still have our Jeeps.
Do you know where the other person is buried? The one you said was probably
Where
one
Katie
taken.
Moran is, in, I think it's St. Catherine's Cemetery in Oil City. The girl that's a librarian down there gave us a map and real explicit instructions. She sent us pictures. She had a real big monument, I mean, almost as tall as the ceiling here. So she come from a family that had money. They were Irish immigrants, her parents were, and they were both dead by the time the train accident happened. She lived in Oil City with her brother, who came to claim her body. And then the funeral was held in one of the mansions over there. So, yeah, hers is marked.
Doug and I went to school with a Matt Moran who lived in Tarport, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's a relation, but.
We'd give anything to have pictures of the women. But that far back, they didn't even put pictures in obituaries back then in the newspapers. So the only way you could find it out is if you, with their maiden name, called and checked around, which I did. Lady Sadie, her maiden name was Stoop. There was one person in Bradford by that name, and I called and nobody would answer. A lot of people won't because of phone scammers and everything like that. And then Katie Moran, I did call down there and make contact with somebody. And I explained the story, and he says, "Oh, you want the Morans that are on the other side of town." So now, is this the lower class mad at the upper class, or the upper class mad at the lower class? I don't know. But it obviously showed you there was a divide. The family she came from had good money, big money, because it was held, the funeral was held in a private mansion. She has a big stone there. But I couldn't get, and then, well, I tried the name Stoop over in Warren also. Nobody would answer the phone. I'd leave a message, and then you probably just think, oh, that's another crazy phone scammer, even though I said, here's what we're trying to do. But you'd almost have to see if you could get lucky on it and find a descendant that might know if one of their ancestors was on that train. And we'd still give anything to have pictures, but I don't know that we'll ever find those.
Someday.
You never know. All of a sudden, something could accidentally happen, and look at that. It's like that. Last night I was over at the Landmark Society looking at the train lantern there. I had no idea it was that big. Molly sent me a picture of it. Well, you can't tell from a picture. I thought it was something small you could grab, put on your arm, and take a walk. I looked at that and I said, oh, Molly, wow. You don't have to bring that over. It was really nice of her and Kevin to bring that over. But that, we don't know which train that one went to. We checked all the numbers on it. But it would have looked a lot like what was on the BBK number 11. Most of them were all pretty much common. Massive thing. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.